Hello, I'm Tom Cross and welcome to Cross Examination. I'm a barrister in London working on cases with cultural, moral and ethical importance. In this podcast, expert panellists join me to take an independent look at the law surrounding one of these issues. Today, I examine the way the law protects reputations from damage by the media. This is an area where court claims can be complex and expensive, but for some time affected persons have been able to make complaints to some sort of regulatory body. A decade ago, the recommendations of the Leveson inquiry into press culture as to what a new such regulator should look like were rejected by the government. Some think that the body which did emerge, IPSO, to which most but not all of the print media subscribe, is little more than a press stooge, ill-equipped and unprepared to hold publishers to account when they transgress. Others are less critical, but most agree that any system is unlikely to please everyone, given that the protection of reputation usually requires to be balanced against free expression. So what does the present system have to commend it, and can its pitfalls be remedied? Cross-examining with me today, as always, are two of the country's most expert lawyers on the topic. Mark Stevens, CBE, was once described by the Law Society Gazette as the patron solicitor of previously lost causes, and is currently described by the Legal 500 as an extremely experienced lawyer who's not afraid to roll up his sleeves and who gives bold advice where needed. He's been involved in numerous high-profile cases, including in relation to the media. Jonathan Coad is a specialist media lawyer who for 30 years has acted for high-profile companies and individuals whose reputation and/or privacy is threatened by the media. He's also represented broadcasters and publishers of high public interest material in resisting what he would describe as meritless claims against publication. Welcome to you both. Jonathan Coad, can I start with you? That there are various options, or I suppose theoretical options, for people concerned about their reputation being undermined to try and protect it. We have a regulatory regime which sits alongside a legal regime. Broadly, we can say, can't we, that there's print media, including online media, on the one hand, and broadcast media on the other hand. Just let's look at the first of those, print, including online media. Set out the regulatory framework for us. That's something which the Leveson inquiry had thought about.
It is, and he thought very carefully about that. And he had expert advisors with him, which represented both sides of the divide. We all thought when his recommendations were made that they were very modest and reasonable. I'm not absolutely sure it's right to say that the government rejected them. It's more that the government refused to enact the necessary legislation to enforce them. The press moved in very quickly because they didn't like the Leveson recommendations at all, as is shown by the fact that not one single Fleet Street newspaper has signed up to a Leveson-compliant regulator, and they created the Independent Press Standards Organisation, which weirdly started out in the same offices with the same code and the same personnel as the discredited predecessor, the Press Complaints Commission. Now, all but 3 Fleet Street titles have signed up to that, and the exceptions are the Financial Times, the Guardian, and the Independent, all of whom have different reasons for not signing. But otherwise, Fleet Street has signed up to it and has, of course, lauded it. My own view is different, but certainly Fleet Street has proclaimed it as a bold new initiative which will hold them to account.
How does IPSO basically work?
It's essentially a claims handling organisation. It doesn't actually impose standards at all. First of all, it publishes a code written entirely by newspaper editors. And what then happens is if someone believes that there has been an infringement of the code, then they can make a complaint to IPSO, and IPSO will initially try and mediate a settlement of that complaint between the complainant and the newspaper. And if that doesn't succeed, then they will adjudicate it. But it is a long, drawn-out process, and an adjudication normally takes about 6 to 8 months to achieve, which stands rather in stark contrast to Section 1.2 of the Code, which requires newspapers where they've transgressed their obligations to correct them promptly. It's difficult to reconcile that with an adjudication process which takes up to 8 months.
You mentioned Section 1 of the Code, which is broadly about accuracy. Part of Section 1 concerns the situation where IPSO say that a correction should be published and says that it should be done with due prominence. You've been critical, Jonathan, I think, of the way in which Ipso enforces that or doesn't enforce that provision?
I've been very critical of that, and I was critical of the Press Complaints Commission process of establishing what prominence was in the previous incarnation of a press regulator, and I was once sufficiently critical of it in the office of the then chairman of the Press Complaints Commission. He actually threw me out of his office, and I was frog-marched out of Ipso. So let's take a massive front-page story like Queen backs Brexit, which of course was misleading and inaccurate, as Ipso found. There will have been millions and millions and millions of people who would never dream of buying a Sun newspaper, who will have seen that not only on their apps, but walking past newsagents, on radio programmes. And also, it could be seen by anyone with reasonable eyesight from at least 100 yards away. The Sun story was in the run-up to the referendum, whether we should come in or come out of the EU. Now, the correction, when it was eventually published, was only on page 2, and at the bottom of page 1, there was a line about a centimetre high, which simply referred to the fact that there'd been an adjudication. Now, the practical reality is that 98% of the people that read that front page allegation will have had absolutely no idea that it had been retracted and been corrected at all. So from that perspective, the Ipso process was pretty well useless.
Mark Stevens, do you share that concern of Jonathan about the way in which Ipso approaches the Section 1 element of its code, which requires the press to take care not to publish inaccurate, misleading or distorted information?
Yes, I do. I think that Ipso has become something of the fox guarding the chickens. I always work on a basis that a decent regulator will have about a third of complaints upheld, about a third of complaints not upheld, and about a third outside the remit of that particular regulator. And if you look from advertising standards right the way through to any other decent regulator, you can see the effectiveness by comparing those kinds of benchmark standards against them all. Ipso, unfortunately, it's like 1 in 100 are successful in terms of complaints. And that just isn't borne out by the experience which individuals and thinking people will understand. It's therefore not doing its job effectively. And it's made slightly worse by the fact that, of course, libel was intended to be a rich man's game. There was never any legal aid for libel. If you go back into the mists of time, libel emerges in the court system as an alternative method of determining a blot on the family escutcheon. So it was effectively an alternative dispute resolution to prevent the sons of the landed from dueling and killing one another. And of course, if you're wealthy and you're going against a wealthy newspaper, that's probably an even match. But if you happen to be averagely wealthy, there's no prayer that you can get your resolution organised, or you can get your vindication. And essentially, the system is set up as if middle class and even reasonably wealthy people's reputations are less valuable than the wealthy who can afford to retain either Jonathan or myself.
And there's a point not just about the number of complaints upheld, but also the willingness, some people say, of Ipso to dish out the fines that it is within their power to do.
Yes, and I think the problem is that it's not really a watchdog, it's more of a lapdog. It doesn't actually bare its sharp and jagged teeth. It doesn't, as you say, fine. It doesn't hold newspapers to account when they don't give appropriate prominence to a particular apology. And we are talking about a correction and vindication here. So in some respects, the vindication has to be as prominent and as newsworthy as the original poison that was put into the words on the page.
If somebody has a complaint and feels that the regulator is ineffective, they might feel compelled to take legal action. Let's turn to that then. Legal claims are, of course, possible against the print, including the online media. Broadly, there's defamation law, and there's the law about privacy, breach of confidence, and misuse of private information. Defamation, first of all, in a nutshell, what is it?
It's basically lowering somebody in the estimation of right-thinking people. So if you say Mark's a murderer, then obviously people are going to think less well of me than if they think that I'm not a murderer. And therefore, you are lowered in the estimation of right-thinking people. And it is to correct or indeed to affirm whether I am a murderer or not, and therefore whether my reputation was properly besmirched or not, that we have the libel laws. And of course, alongside them, we have privacy laws, which mean that absent some compelling public interest, you're not entitled to intrude on somebody's privacy. And I usually sum it up as you're entitled to the privacy of the hospital bed, the funeral parlour, the marital bed, and the confessional. And it probably goes a bit further than that. But if you think about it in those broad terms of, your home life and your religious practices and your other practices at home, then in those circumstances, that all should be private, absent some really overwhelming public interest.
It may be that there may be more potent, a wider range of remedies if you sue in defamation, but the action isn't straightforward, is it? It's very complex.
That's absolutely right. And I represented David Steele and Helen Morris, the McLibel couple, for 11 years pro bono, along with Keir Starmer, because we thought that there was a terrible injustice. Effectively, McDonald's were seeking to silence them by bringing serried ranks of lawyers to stop them criticising the food and employment practices of McDonald's. That case went all the way up to the top courts in the United Kingdom and then went to the European Court of Human Rights. And one of the points that we were successful on was that legal aid is not available for libel. And essentially, the point that the European Court took was, yes, it was important that in certain circumstances, individuals should be entitled to vindicate their reputations. They should be allowed to have that freedom of speech. Because under international law and our own domestic law, the obligation is upon the state to create an environment where people's human rights can be enforced. And of course, it is clear if you don't have legal aid for libel or you don't have the financial resources, it's an illusory remedy. And as an illusory remedy, you do not have an effective remedy. But unfortunately, no government of whatever hue has so far decided to address this inequality.
Jonathan, from the media's perspective, there are a number of defences to libel in the Defamation Act 2013. It's clear, isn't it, that there is a defence if the publication is, broadly speaking, true, so-called justification defence. But what you publish doesn't always have to be true in order for a defence to be available. Just explain for us the defence in Section 4 of the Defamation Act 2013.
Well, I'm really glad you raised that, Tom, because that very much also connects with the importance of ipso. It was originally a judge-made defence, which we all used to call the Reynolds defence, after the House of Lords decision which created it. Now, that was then abolished in the 2013 Defamation Act, and it was supposedly simplified into Section 4. Now, that Section 4 defence provides a complete defence to untrue and defamatory allegations if two requirements are fulfilled. One, the subject matter of the allegation was a public interest, which it nearly always is. It's quite rightly a fairly broad test. The background is always the second part of that defence, which is this. The publisher must reasonably believe, and that's the key word, reasonably, that the publication served the public interest. Now, in legal speak, the term reasonably means that it's on an objective test, i.e. it's not just enough for the publisher to believe genuinely public interest was served by the publication. That interest must be assessed by the court to be reasonable. Now, that, to me, is an insane piece of law. I've never understood it.
I would take a slightly different perspective. The use of English is not always precise. It's not always susceptible of having the same meaning to all people. And therefore, the House of Lords, as it was then, decided that in cases where there was an overwhelming public interest, as long as you had been responsible in the way in which you had gone about the reporting, it was in the public interest that information should otherwise come into the public domain. And a lot of these cases were set against terror financing and the evolution of Al-Qaeda, with lots of people coming from around the world to launder their reputations ill-deservedly in London courts. And the judges were getting more and more irritated with false vindications for these people because there was an absence of evidence. So I think it was a helpful and welcome development. And I haven't really seen too many abuses of it. It is often used as a try-on in cases involving celebrities. But when you're talking about matters of state and importance, like the war in Ukraine or genocide, then in those circumstances, I think it was an important addition to the armoury of lawyers to do justice between people.
All right, that's libel. Let's move on to think about other things in the toolkit of the lawyer going to court to protect reputation. There's a tort, as we call it. There's a legal avenue called misuse of private information, which has developed, hasn't it, in recent years, Mark, from a starting point that English law was very reluctant to protect privacy. We've identified that under libel law, the media may be able to say things even if they're not true. Under misuse of private information, however, somebody can come and prohibit the media from saying things even when they are true. Just explain that for us.
Well, that's a very difficult area. So you have cases where somebody behaves appallingly, but they do so in their private life, and therefore they say it's not susceptible to examination of the public interest. The difficulty here is, I think, not the law. The difficulty is the appetite for some of these stories which have titillating information.
The ability for people to protect their privacy against such intrusion was broadened reasonably recently still by the Cliff Richard case, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. And, you know, in that particular case, there was an opportunity to develop the law. So most people remember that there was a police raid on Sir Cliff Richard's home. He was not there at the time, but the media were tipped off. And every major news broadcaster had a satellite truck at the gates of Sir Cliff's compound. And indeed, the BBC decided to hire a helicopter so it could get aerial shots through the windows of his penthouse apartment, which obviously was a gross intrusion. The court had to come up with a balance between the public's right to know on the one hand and the privacy of the individual. And they said on that occasion that unless there is some compelling public interest, then the private life of an individual trumps, because we have a presumption of innocence in English law. And if you are being investigated for criminality, unless and until you are charged, then the matter should stay private. That's not as uncontroversial as you may think. There are cases where people have needed to invade private lives in order for it to be in the public interest.
We saw that also in a more recent Supreme Court case, ZXC, about Bloomberg's publication of details about allegations against a businessman. Even though there was public interest in the public knowing the information, his privacy outweighed that interest. I mean, this greater inclination of the courts, perhaps, Mark, through cases like Cliff Richard, through cases like ZXC, to give weight to the privacy right of individuals, might that have played into what's recently happened in Hugh Edwards' case?
Yes, I think it has. That was ostensibly one of the reasons which was given for Hugh Edwards not being identified at the beginning. The problem with the Hugh Edwards case was that he was effectively jigsaw identified. So a whole load of clients called me, all gay men, and they were being speculated about online. Sometime on Saturday evening, the additional tidbit of information was handed out to the media, which was that this was one of the highest paid figures at the BBC, earning six figures. Well, of course, that information is then publicly available, and therefore the universe of six men who ultimately lighted upon, five of them wrongly, and one of them, Hugh Edwards, should not have been able to be identified either. And in those circumstances, of course, the speculation online forced the position where essentially the information came out on social media, and Hugh's wife had no alternative really but to indicate that it was Hugh and that he was in hospital. There was virtually no public interest in this story whatsoever. Private activities, albeit of a public figure, should remain entirely private unless there's some wrongdoing. And of course, the article in The Sun at the beginning started off by making the suggestion that criminality may have been involved. That wasn't stood up by the police, who said, we can't see anything to investigate here, let alone open an investigation. And it became clearer and clearer that there was no criminality, and therefore the purpose in having the story was just not there. And yet this fell hard on the heels of Philip Schofield's essentially public abuse. And this seems to have become a thing in British media, that it's okay to excoriate people for their private behaviours. Well, none of us would stand the scrutiny of the sort of private behaviours that were being covered in the newspapers. And I think that is the vice here.
Jonathan, tell us about the Schofield case from your perspective.
People may or may not know that I acted for Philip Schofield throughout. It was, in the 30 years I've been doing this work, the most difficult that I've ever done. I was getting up to, and quite often, a full 20 emails and or calls an hour. There's obviously a limit to what I can say, but for professional reasons. But Philip has spoken out via a BBC interview, and one of the things he said is that if it wasn't for his daughters, he wouldn't be here. We are in a situation where both, to some extent, the media and the social media essentially put someone in the stocks and fling allegations against them until they're driven, in case of one of my clients, Caroline Flack, to an early grave. I worked very, very hard during that time to make sure that false allegations didn't make their way into the media, but I was only able to do that because Philip could afford to fund me. This is one of the fundamental problems that we have. How do we manage a liberal society where we must have free speech, where we must have good, courageous, public interest investigative journalism on one side, but on the other side, some protection for people like Hugh Edwards and Philip Schofield, who have been absolutely put to death by the media for no good reason, and in Philip's case has been driven to contemplating suicide, and in the case of Caroline Flack, driven to suicide.
Without transgressing your professional obligations, Jonathan, can I ask you this about Philip Schofield? Does his case illustrate to you an inadequacy in the legal framework in any way, either regulatory or court-wise, legal-wise, in its proper sense? And if so, what?
It's a very good question, and it's difficult because there's so much to say about that. I mean, there was an absolute media firestorm. We go back to the failure of the government to ensure that there is a Leveson-compliant press. For all the media inquiries, 49 of them were from the print press, and one was from the broadcast media, which is better regulated. But at the moment, there is such a sense in the press of really being free to do whatever they want. That then feeds into being prepared to drive people like Caroline into an early grave. And while that sense of immunity is present, then anyone, in the public domain are going to have the distress and discomfort of watching people that we've got to know and care about being simply taken apart by what Tony Blair has called the feral media.
There is a deeper point here, which is there is a sort of moral dilemma in society that people often on social media, but it's reflected in the tabloid media, don't think about the consequences of what they would do. They would do something in the media or online that they would never do face-to-face to an individual. And I think it's that failure to empathise, which is a major problem. And that creates for us a dilemma because there is a lacuna in the law. So in the case of Hugh Edwards' case, I think the BBC dropped the ball. They should have sought an injunction contra mundum against the world to protect all of their six-figure presenters. There should have been no speculation, and that injunction should have been served on all the newspapers and all the social media companies. They didn't, and of course it got worse. Now, That's not overcritical of the BBC. It was unfortunate because they were obviously baffled as to what to do in this particular case. But I do think we can expect these problems to arise in the future. And I think you will find a very willing judiciary prepared to try and resolve the problem, to fill that lacuna, to do justice and to help society find its way through this sort of morass of emailing and online bullying and harm.
All right, thank you both for the moment. We've discussed IPSO complaints and the differences between them and court claims. I spoke to the beautician, Danielle Hindley, about a very difficult experience she had following accusations made against her by the Mail on Sunday.
My name is Danielle Hindley. My business, it's a beauty business called Dolly's House. I do everything in hair, nails, beauty. I do a lot of semi-permanent makeup. I started when I was 16 and I'm 38 now, so I've built up quite a good reputation and client base. So on the 31st of December 2017, the Mail on Sunday wrote an article about me, basically making out I was probably the worst beautician on the planet. I had a client, a disgruntled client, who thought she had a complaint, but she didn't have a valid complaint at all. She actually said, I'm going to go to the Daily Mail if you don't give my money back. But because I hadn't done anything wrong, obviously I didn't issue a refund. So when she threatened to go to the Daily Mail, my initial response was, go on then, because they're not going to print something that's not true. And then I got a booking who turns out was an undercover reporter from the Mail on Sunday. I just got a text message saying, can I book in for plasma skin tightening, which is what the original client had. Basically, this particular service, I was one of the first 50 practitioners to offer it in the UK. I was getting a lot of inquiries and doing a lot of this particular treatment at the time. She came to my home, booked in, and I don't know what it was, but I knew from the moment she walked in my home that she was not a client. I Googled a phone number that she booked with and it came up that she was a Mail on Sunday reporter. And she basically said, if you've got any issues, email my editor, which I did. And this was about 3 weeks before they ever published anything. They never responded to my email until the day after they published it. And then they were like, oh, sorry, we just saw your email. Can we help? So I know that they knew before they ever published that it wasn't true. When they did write the article, they called me, I think, a bodge job beautician, a cosmetic cowboy, a backstreet establishment. They insinuated that I wasn't qualified, that I wasn't insured, that I wasn't accredited, that I wasn't licensed. And they'd said that I'd disfigured somebody's face, which I didn't, and that I'd left her severely depressed. I still have an online booking system. And when someone cancels an appointment, it pings my phone. And that day and the few days after that article, it was just ping, 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 just cancellation after cancellation. It had a catastrophic effect on my business as well as my mental health because of all the different knock-on effects they'd had. They put my photo on there that they'd got off social media. They put where I lived. My neighbours were calling me scum. I had ex-boyfriends that I'd got away from that had found out where I lived. People were sharing it and tagging me, and girls that had bullied me in school, for example. You know, I'm in my 30s. That should not be affecting me. And then the next problem was because it affected my mental health so bad, I wasn't actually getting out of bed. So even on the odd occasion that I did have the odd customer, I couldn't do it. You know, I do treatments like microblading, which is you're using a tiny little blade, a little bit like tattooing for someone's eyebrows. You go a little bit wrong and that is catastrophic. So I had the shakes constantly. I had to cancel them because I physically, not just mentally, I physically couldn't do the job. So I placed a complaint with IPSO. I didn't realise they're not quite as independent as they advertised themselves to be at the time. So I had a few different parts to my complaint. One was the accuracy, obviously, of the article because it was completely inaccurate. And the other part was my privacy. Now, it says on their code of conduct that they shouldn't infringe on someone's home life and they shouldn't do anything that infringes on someone's family life. So one of my main concerns was once I found out that she was an undercover journalist and I found out that she had secret camera footage of me and my child in our home, I had a big problem with that because my son came down after he'd given himself a bath in his boxer shorts and that's on their footage. Now, they ruled in my favour on the accuracy to print a correction on page 2, and they gave me the date it was going to be, and I was really excited, and I was telling all my friends to buy it, this is going to put everything right. They didn't print it on page 2, they printed it on page 40 or something stupid. I emailed Ipso and said, why has my correction not been put on page 2 like you promised me? And they just responded and said, we've spoken to the Mail on Sunday, and it's because they had a more important story to write on Prince Harry and Meghan. And I think I replied saying it wasn't more important to me, and they just didn't come back with anything. That was it, case closed. After Ipso ruled in my favour on the accuracy, I was contacted by somebody from an organisation called Hacked Off. And from what I remember, they basically were saying, how did you get your complaint upheld? Because they never uphold anyone's complaints. It's less than 1% or something. So then the chairman of Hacked Off called me and said, are you going to sue? And I said, well, I've thought about it, but I didn't know what kind of solicitor or lawyer that I needed. So I was just phoning solicitors just off Google. I phoned more than 50. And every single one of them, except for one, said, we won't take it on. And there was one guy, I couldn't even tell you the name of the company. He said, I'd take it on, but I need £40,000 deposit to get started. Well, I was a single mum at the time. I'd just had my business shafted by all this. I did not have £40,000 laying around. I was only just managing to feed my son. It was a good job that I was too mentally ill to eat myself, because I probably couldn't afford it to feed myself. So then when I spoke to the chairman of Hacked Off, he said, I've got a friend of mine. He's, a high-profile media law lawyer. Do you want me to speak to him? So I said, yes, please. And then that's when Jonathan Code phoned me, and we had a chat for maybe half an hour, maybe an hour. And he just said, right, I'm going to help you, and we're going to take them to court. They'd already sort of said they'd done wrong with Ipso, and then they realised that I had legal help to take it further. Then they started saying, oh, well, actually, we think that was wrong. We don't think we should have said that we did anything wrong with Ipso. And it went back and forward a little bit, and they just kept changing their mind. And I kept hearing these words, public interest, all the time, and just thinking, I really am not in the public interest. I think my case was classed as being settled out of court, even though we went to court. And I remember at one point I said to Jonathan, what am I likely to come away with? I think he said about £10,000. And I remember thinking, that's not enough for what I'm going through, but they could give me £1 million and it still wouldn't be enough for what I was going through. So in the end, I just forgot about the money side of it, and all I was interested in is the truth. As much as I had really good support with the court process, of course, it's not victim friendly. It's all set up to be impossible for normal people like myself. It's different with celebrities because they've got a bit of clout, they can speak up, they've got a voice to be heard, they've got money. When I was going through the Ipso process, for example, I couldn't understand why it was one rule for me and one rule for the Mail, because I didn't know at the time that it was the papers that basically fund that organisation. So at the time, I just kept thinking, what? Why am I being treated like I don't matter when I've been really wronged here? And the whole process, start to finish, it didn't feel like an uphill fight. It felt like I was hanging off the edge of a cliff fight. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy to go through all that.
Jonathan, a couple of things that struck me particularly listening to Danielle Hindley. This is a capable person. She did the Ipso complaint herself, as she explained, for example, not without courage, with plenty of conviction. But ultimately, and to the point that you made earlier, that the correction she got from Ipso didn't have equal prominence. They might have argued it had due prominence under Section 1 of the Ipso Code, but it certainly wasn't equal. It was on page 40.
I agree, but I think the problems in her case run much deeper than that. The reason why she was so abused by the Mail on Sunday, and I absolutely use that word advisedly because she was, is because they had a complete lack of respect for their own regulatory system. Now, she did indeed succeed, partly helped by a good member of staff. There are helpful members of the Ipso staff and not helpful. But the difficulty they faced was, as she said, she couldn't find anyone to pick up the case. Now, what then happened is I took up the cudgels for her, which I would have been happy to do pro bono at the outset. And I had the most appalling battle with a newspaper and its lawyers to get her any remedy. She mentioned the figure of £10,000. I can't tell you what she eventually got, but it was quite a lot more than that. But the battle that I had to have in order to achieve that was only possible, being modest, because like Mark, I've been doing this for many, many years. I know how to fight my client's corner, but there aren't many of us. And I think she tried 50 lawyers before she found me. And had it not been for Hacked Off putting us together, then she probably would have got no remedy at all.
Mark, one of the points that Danielle Hindley made in her account was that she'd been successful before Ipso, in the sense that they'd found that the Mail's article was significantly misleading. But the Mail on Sunday didn't accept liability when she then subsequently sued them for libel. And they used the same Section 4 defence that we were talking about. They said that it was publication which they reasonably believed in the public interest, whether or not it had been true, whether or not it had been accurate. You were defending, I think, the Section 4 defence earlier. Danielle Hindley's case might be an example of the potential injustice of that defence?
Yes, I think it's a glorious example of it. The inequality of justice in the media world. If she had been rich and famous, she would have been able to retain expert lawyers and she would have been able to get a remedy. As it is, it looks as though there was a sort of cynical assessment that she'd never have enough money to bring a case, and therefore they didn't enforce the challenges. And, it is fatuous nonsense to suggest that the destruction of this woman's business on a false basis was in the public interest. Of course it's not. It goes back to that old Mark Twain saying, a lie goes twice around the world before the truth has pulled his boots on. And in this particular case, it had direct real-world consequences. And it's those kinds of injustice which I think the system is failing at the moment. It's failing people who have very bad things said about them, but there's very little they can do about it. But that doesn't vitiate the point that there is a need for matters which are genuinely in the public interest. And you'll remember how I framed them about matters of geopolitical importance, the conflict in the Sahel, Russian organized crime, the war in Ukraine. Those things have real public interest. This is just, frankly, infotainment by the press.
We talked earlier about the regulatory framework applicable to print media. What about broadcast media? You've got a different regulator that is a statutory regulator there, Ofcom, in other words, whose functions are given by legislation and which has its own code and which broadcasters have to comply with in order to be licensed. Does that mean, Jonathan, from your perspective, that there's a more satisfactory setup when it comes to broadcast?
Yes, absolutely. The Ofcom code is taken very seriously by broadcasters. I've legaled out television programmes of every variety, from comedy programmes like South Park through to some very, very heavy and controversial documentaries. And I know that the attitude that this is a code they need to adhere to. And that runs also to the culture, because I completely agree with Mark that there is a cultural and moral problem here. And the most common section, which I use, Section 7 of the Ofcom Code, which deals with fairness. Essentially, broadcasters mustn't treat people unfairly. Now, that's absolutely much, much wider than the accuracy provision of Section 1 of the Ipso Code. But Ofcom, unlike Ipso, does fine, and has indeed fined. Mark and I both know that hell will freeze up before Ipso ever finds anybody. But as I say, Ofcom will show its teeth. And the result of that is that the quality of news, which comes out particularly of the major broadcasters, Sky, BBC and ITV, and I have acted for Sky and ITV, is much, much higher. And they are much more reliable and much better trusted by the public.
I mean, this is a question I quite often ask on the podcast about whether or not something is as it is because of a law or because of the culture of the people who are subject to the law. There might be an issue here as to whether broadcast media are anyway culturally more willing to think about and be protective of damaging people's reputation. Mark, do you think that's right? In other words, to what extent is the Ofcom framework responsible for, as it were, keeping broadcast media in check to a greater extent?
I think it's in part about the organisations who broadcast. So, it was introduced, this regulation, at a time before satellite television, before cable television, and there was dominance amongst 3 or 4 terrestrial channels. The difficulty is that Ofcom is, I think, straining at the seams because it's now seeking to regulate a much more diverse and plural media. So the emergence of GB News, for example, has, I think, tested it. And of course, the success of GB News, which I personally quite surprised at, but it regularly beats BBC News, Sky News and ITV News, and mostly in red wall constituencies, which is something which people in North London are pretty horrified by. But what it tells me is that it's meeting an unmet need. They are actually now coming under pressure. So we're seeing very heavy lobbying of Ofcom. The last time this happened was in relation to a Kurdish TV station where they were heavily pressured by the Turkish government and they caved in. And that Med TV went off to broadcast from Europe, where there's a much lighter touch regulatory framework. And so I do think there is an argument for a lighter touch regulatory framework. And I find myself regularly these days saying to broadcasters, look, do you want to put yourself through the Ofcom hoops, or would you prefer just to broadcast from somewhere in Europe and you won't have any of the problems that you might have with Ofcom? And I think that's a debate to be had.
What about the additional difficulties of the law created by the social media world we live in now? But there's also the use by the commercial media of social media. Laura Koonsberg, to give an example, on the BBC, with an enormous following on Twitter, or X as it's now called. This creates, doesn't it, Jonathan, an additional layer for the lawyer in seeking to vindicate reputation, because they have to think not just about the publication by the commercial media, but also about trying to get things down off social media as an intermediary in a dispute between the individual and the person who is publishing against them.
Yes, I mean, that's absolutely right in practical terms. In theoretical terms, it doesn't make a ha'porth of difference. I mean, defamation is defamation, and a publication via the social media of something which is defamatory is a libel and can be acted upon. And there are a number of high profiles, Katie Hopkins, the Sally Burko, who found out that libeling people via the social media can be an expensive thing to do. Where it's a top journalist who has a vast following, it doesn't create a huge problem.
Reputation management, as its very name suggests, is an area where some people think that the role of the lawyer and the role of the public relations consultant might be practically indistinguishable. Is it like that? Should it be like that? If you're someone whose reputation has been damaged, is it an effective approach to deploy not just a lawyer, but somebody from the world of PR?
Often what is being discussed in the media is not that important in the overall scheme of things. And we as lawyers can be quite expensive. The answer, it seems to me, is not less speech, but more speech. So if someone puts a falsity out, then you ensure and curate through your PR representative the opportunity for good PR to tell a different story. Now, that's not possible for everybody, but certainly for famous people, it's possible. I would be concerned about people like Harvey Weinstein and others who are in a position to use lawyers to silence people. So I do think there's a need for greater amounts of speech. But there are red lines. And I think one of the things that we saw in the extract that you played a moment ago is a red line has been crossed in that case. And it was important. It was about the fundamental rights to earn a living of an individual. And society and the law are not providing effective remedies yet.
Well, we've come to a red line at the end of the podcast. Jonathan Coe, Mark Stevens, thanks very much for cross-examining with me today.
Thanks very much, Tom.
Thank you, Tom. I thoroughly enjoyed that, and I think some really important issues were addressed.
We've reached the end of the podcast, but we'll be back soon, and we'd love to know what you'd like us to examine next. Tell us what you're interested in or concerned about in the world of law by tweeting at CrossExaminePod. Remember to follow us wherever you get your podcasts, and if you've got time, we'd love a positive review on Apple Podcasts. It's the best way to spread the word about cross-examination. Meanwhile, I've been Tom Cross, and until next time, goodbye.
Cross-Examination is written and presented by Tom Cross. The producer is Jelena Sofronijevic.